Right. So if you remember, we are today we're ending a 3-week series. We've been talking about Sabbath, right? And so the first week that we talked about Sabbath, we talked about freedom and how we are no longer slaves, that God has freed us. And we talked about how important rest is for our health, for all aspects of our health, our physical health, our spiritual health, our relational health, our emotional health. Last week, we talked about our identity, that we are not God, and that when we refuse to stop working because we think the world is going to stop if we don't keep working, we are not acknowledging our identity as a beloved creature of a loving God. Today, we're going to talk about community and how these Sabbath rules are meant to be a blessing not just to us individually, but to our community, to the community as a whole. And the scriptures that we read today talk about specifically land and debt. Sabbath was not just a one day a week command, but it was a 1 year every 7 years command as well, when the land was to rest and when a debt was to be forgiven. The first scripture that we looked at this morning talked about the land. Our land is important for every community. Now, most of us are not farmers, so we are not perhaps tied directly to the land, or we don't see that connection. But really, land is very important because that's where so much of our food comes from. And if it's not healthy, we don't have the food we need, as well as our neighbors don't have the food that they need. In fact, these Sabbath laws not only commanded rest for the land every 7 years, but there was also a command that every 7 years, there was to be a year of Jubilee, when the land rested, but when land also went back to those who had originally owned it. Now, these rules about land do a couple of things. One, they remind us that the land is not really ours, that it is God's, and that we are called to care for it, that we only have it on land. But it also calls us to remember our neighbors and how we are to care for them, to make sure that the land is healthy so that everyone can eat. And not only those neighbors we have right now, but the future generations that will come after us. Whether we ourselves have children or not, the human race will continue, and we need to keep the land healthy so that future generations can eat and get what they need from that land. Any of you who know anything about agriculture know that there's this idea in agriculture of crop rotation, right? Of using a field for a while and then either changing the crop that's on it or just letting it lay fallow for a year or two so that it can be replenished. And often what happens is when that land lies fallow, then animals are grazed on that land that's just growing grass and weeds and everything to help then fertilize it so it will be fruitful again. I won't exactly go into all the detail of how that happens. I'm sure you know that. But this passage also tells us that we're to care for the land for the sake not only of the land itself, but for the animals with whom we share the earth. They are fellow creatures of God. And if you remember back at creation, it's our call to care for them. And we like to do that sometimes, except that when they're doing something that we consider destructive. I don't know, it was a year ago maybe? I was upstairs one morning and John's downstairs and he's looking out the back door and he's like, "Diana, come quick, there's a deer in the backyard." And I come running down and we're looking at the deer and I look over and I say, "Oh look, there's one in the garden." All of a sudden it wasn't such a cute little furry animal. He's like throwing up the window, "Get out of my garden!" But the scripture says that we are to provide food and provide rest for the land so that even the wild animals will have something to eat. You know, and this goes for both tame animals and wild animals, it says. And our modern agricultural practices are not always very kind to animals, especially the animals that we eat. I don't know how many of you remember back in the 90s, there was a marketing campaign called California Happy Cows. Do you remember that? Some of you remember that? And it showed these, happy cows in the fields of California eating the grass and everything. Well, it just so happened that that same time, we took a vacation and went out to California to visit my aunt and uncle. And we get out there, and we're driving along, and we see these field after field of these cows standing like knee to belly deep in mud and muck, eating out of these troughs with grain in them. It's like, okay, so much for California happy cows. This is the reality. Another thing I think about is I won't buy those great big chicken breasts. For one thing, it's just too much food for John and I to eat one of those. But for the second thing, you see the stories about how these chickens, to get them that big, how they're treated. Yeah, they're just chickens, but they're fellow creatures. And what kind of existence is that for them? So this is supposed to protect not only the land, but also the animals. And as I said, most of us aren't farmers, but there are ways that we can connect ourselves more fully to the land and to think about things like where our food comes from and how it's produced. Maybe plant a garden or eat more local food or more organic food. Maybe raise chickens or goats or whatever in your backyard. Who knows? The problem is that if we don't take care of the land, it won't be there to care for us either. But these scriptures also, these commands for Sabbath are also meant to protect the poor and the marginalized in our larger community. I want you to think about it. First of all, they're meant to provide rest. Who is it that works the most? It's those who are poor and have no choice. If you're poor and barely making ends meet, you may have to work 2 or 3 jobs. You don't get weekends, you don't get nights off, you don't get a vacation. I heard a story on NPR this week about a couple who had gotten married and because of student debt and everything, realized that it was going to be like 10 years before they could afford to take a vacation. When you are poor, you need that extra income. You don't have time to take off, and because of the kind of job you probably have, you don't really have much leverage to try and get better conditions. The Sabbath laws protected slaves as well. In the Sabbath laws in the scripture, after 7 years of service, slaves were to be released. So as we care for the poor and the marginalized, Sabbath provides rest for them, a time when everything stops. But it's also about food availability. The Sabbath laws had a part that's called gleaning, where the farmers weren't supposed to take everything in their field or everything in their trees, but to leave some from the poor. And the scripture that talks about leaving the land fallow that 7th year so that the poor can collect whatever comes up. Those of you who've had a garden know that if you've got good soil, even if you don't plant one year, you're probably going to have stuff still come up on its own, right? It's going to self-seed and come up on its own. And sometimes those plants are even healthier than the ones you plant. But to provide food for those. This map down here in the corner, you ever heard of food deserts? Yeah. This is from a 2016 story, and that's a map of South Bend. And in 2016, the USDA said that South Bend had 7 food deserts in it. That's where it means it's more than 10 miles to an actual grocery store. Now, that doesn't mean there's not food available in the area. There are convenience stores and things like that sell chips and pop and lunch meat and that kind of thing. But to get to like really healthy food, At least 10 miles. What's another struggle that poor people have? Transportation. So if you got to go 10 miles to get to healthy food, chances are you're not going to get there, at least not very often. The scripture from Deuteronomy specifically talks about debt relief, about forgiving the debt of the poor on that 7th year. Do you know that for the lowest 20% of people in the United States, lowest economic, 20% of the economic strata, most of them, those people, have a negative net worth, because if you take what they own and you subtract what they owe, it's a negative number. How are you ever going to get ahead in that kind of situation? How are you ever going to make yourself rise to a better place? And what happens is many people are barely making it, and then something happens. The car breaks down. Somebody gets sick. You lose your job. And you have no resources to fall back on. So you go to a payday lender, and you get a loan at astronomical interest, and you can never get ahead. You're always playing catch-up. Never able to get ahead. So these Sabbath laws that talk about forgiving debt do two things. They allow people to start over if they've had catastrophe in their life, and they prevent the consolidation of power and wealth among the few. There are a lot of causes of wealth inequality in the world. Probably the most obvious one would be differences in income, right? Some people make more than other people. But there are a lot of reasons why that can be. Level of education, gender, race, growth in technology, personal abilities, the labor market supply and demand. But there are some other reasons as well. What about the fact of having financial opportunities to make your money make more money? If you already have a surplus, you can invest that surplus, and you can get more surplus, and you can invest that more surplus and get even more surplus, right? If you are always playing catch-up and never have anything to invest, you never have opportunity for your wealth to grow. And so you get into this cyclical process of either being able to accumulate or being in debt. And then that gets passed on to the next generation, because those who've been able to accumulate pass it on to their kids who have a head start then, right? Those who are in debt pass that debt on. And those kids are even further behind. Another reason for wealth inequality in our world is public policy. I said earlier, income difference, one of those things has to do with level of education. Let me ask you a question. Which schools get better funding? The schools in the poor part of town or the schools in the rich part of town?
In the rich part of town.
Exactly. Yes. And so kids end up with added disadvantage. Same thing with like public works projects that would better a community. Those often go into the wealthier parts of town. So differences in income, whether there's a surplus to invest and inherit, public policy, but also outright discrimination plays into wealth inequality. There is this view in our society that the poor are lazy and undeserving. That somehow they're poor because they don't work hard and they don't deserve to have it anymore. Have you ever heard somebody say, I'm not going to help people on the street, they'll just go spend it on drugs and alcohol, right? Somehow, we don't know that, but we make those assumptions. Have you ever heard somebody voice resentment because they saw somebody in line at the grocery store with food stamps who had a cell phone? Mm-hmm. Right? Do you know that there are a lot of programs that give people in poverty cell phones? Because the truth is that a cell phone is necessary in this day and age if you want to be employed. I mean, that's how people communicate. And so there are programs. So just because somebody has food stamps and a cell phone doesn't mean that they're spending their money on the wrong things. And we think we get to decide what the right things are and the wrong things are. We often see resentment among people as if the poor are taking something away from us. We hear that right now in the whole debate over immigration. That those people come to our country and take our jobs. You want to know the truth? Most of the jobs that those immigrants take are not jobs any of us would be willing to take.
Correct.
At least not at the pay they're willing to take them at. Right? So there are a lot of reasons for wealth inequality. So God's command to forgive debt serves to unify and to heal communities. It gives people a chance to start over, and it allows healing in the community. The truth is that the distinction between rich and poor divides communities. Among the rich, they seek to maintain their wealth often at the expense of the poor. And then the poor lose hope, believing that things will never be any better, that there's no way things are ever going to be better. And we as a society place value on people in relation to how much money they have. Now, some of you may be feeling aggravated or even angry that I'm talking about something that may make you feel like, well, I should be ashamed for what I have. And that's part of the point, is that no matter which side you're on, whether you have money or you don't have money, when we have these attitudes of not being neighbors and not taking care of each other, both sides feel shamed, and both sides feel put out and divided from one another. These Sabbath laws are about the common good, about seeking the good of the neighborhood, of recognizing those around us as our neighbors. Our world chooses profit over people, destruction of natural resources and habitats. Where are they going to put a waste sewage treatment? Where are they going to put a factory that belches out smoke and noise? It's not going to be, there's a friend, not in my neighborhood, right? Who is it that gets put out by those kinds of things? It's the poor. The rich often seek to maintain their wealth at the expense of the poor. Temptation, we have this temptation to guard and protect what's ours. It's mine. I earned it. I don't have to share it with anybody. And so we choose not to see the need around us. Remember, I said earlier that this command about Sabbath is that hinge between how we relate to God and how we relate to other people. It's about turning from our sense of individual right to see our sense of community responsibility to one another. It means that we are called to care for one another. That we are called to see all people as worthy, as created in the image of God. Sabbath is a day of equality where everyone is equally at rest. We are never going to all be equal in what we can produce. Some people have different skills and different access to production things. We're never going to be equal in what we consume. Again, because some have more and some have less. But before God, Sabbath is a reminder that when we stop, all are equal before God. Young and old, rich and poor, slave and free, citizen and foreigner, all are beloved children of God. Sabbath is an invitation to see people as our neighbors rather than as competition. To step out of that mindset of striving and producing and consuming that creates a compulsion to get and acquire that makes neighborliness difficult, if not impossible. There is enough for everyone. Money, enough food, enough shelter. So what would the world look like if the wealth was just redistributed every 7 years? Very different. Yeah. You know, and we may be tending to think that, well, we're not the really wealthy. But when you think about the world, do you know that within the U.S., by the time a U.S. citizen is 60, 70% of us will have experienced at least 1 year within the top 20th percentile of world income. So when we want to start asking the question, you know, well, yeah, Bill Gates should pay off my debt. Maybe the question and the thing that we need to be thinking is that we need to be thinking about our brothers and sisters who live in South Sudan and who live on $246 a year. The scripture says that there will never cease to be needy, and Jesus said that too, right? But it goes on to say, so open your hand and be generous with the needy. Sabbath is an invitation to community. We are all in this boat together. Without it, we would all drown. We need each other. We aren't in a one-person kayak. We're in a big ship all together. We only have one planet, and that's the planet Earth, and that's where we all live together. Boats can be crowded. Elbow room can shrink and not be there. But we need to remember our fellow passengers. Is Sabbath existence even possible? How could we implement it within our communities? I want to point something out. This is never going to happen on a global scale. Our governments and the systems that run them are never going to operate on the Sabbath principle. Can you imagine Chase Bank deciding every 7 years they're going to forgive all the mortgages and all the student loan and all the car debts and all of that? No, it's not going to happen, right? The systems that are in place are never going to live this kind of existence. They are too caught up in power and competition. But I need you to remember, who were these laws given to? The community of God, right? The community of God was called to be an alternative existence among the superpowers that surrounded it. Do you think the Egyptians were any closer to living Sabbath? Do you think the Romans were any closer to living Sabbath? No. Empires don't live Sabbath. No matter when they are existing. God called God's people to be an example of an alternative way of living. My brother and I mentioned before, have different social and theological views. But one thing that he said, and I think he's right, is he said, you know, when government cuts whatever it's cutting, and I get all up in arms, his response to me is, this is the church's opportunity to do what the church is supposed to be doing. Caring for its neighbors. So, it is our responsibility to live Sabbath, to create community. How can we ensure that people around us recognize that they are worthy, that they are loved, that they are created in the image of God? How can we create an environment where people can start over? How can we be people of healing in our communities? How can we lessen the resentment of the rich and offer a source of hope for the poor? How how can we begin to really see our neighbors? How can we put ourselves in a place that allows God to transform our hearts to hearts of generosity? How can we, as God's people, learn to live more simply so that we can give more generously? Sabbath is more than just a day off of work. Sabbath is a philosophy of life. Sabbath is an invitation to beloved